So we had two big reports out yesterday on June 30th. We had the quarterly grain stocks and the acreage report, and didn't really see a lot of fireworks in these reports like I thought we might. Starting with the grain stocks, though, big news there, I guess, is we saw soybean stocks hit over 1 billion bushels, the first time ever in the June report.
That's quite, I mean, it kind of says a little bit about what's been happening as far as the exports are concerned. We've seen our export market kind of get, delayed or not as aggressive because of the tariffs and because of China stepping away from the U.S. market. So without those exports, it kind of shows that our stocks are building as far as soybeans are concerned. So the stocks number was a little bit negative on the soybeans. They were a little bit negative on the wheat side just because they were above expectations and above the previous year. But again, for corn, it was somewhat friendly because it continues to show the strong demand that we have for corn.
And again, there are two, we were talking yesterday about how stocks are about 50-50 between on-farm and off-farm storage, which you said is unusual for this time of year.
It is. I mean, and even when you look back at the March report, we were running about 75-80% on-farm storage, and the rest was in commercial. So we're starting to see those bushels that normally would come into the elevators at this time of year. We've started to see some of that move. So right now we're sitting with about 50-50 on-farm and commercial storage for corn.
Soybean stocks, anything unusual here?
Not really. What's been interesting is that, right now we're sitting with about 40% on farm, 60% in commercial hands. And I think a lot of that, why we're seeing so much on farm from what we would normally see for soybeans at this time, is because of the crush plants and because of the stretched out need for soybeans being delivered on a timely basis to the crush plants instead of most of it going to the export market. So I think we're going to start to see that dynamic change where we'll start to see more stored on farm and less stored in the commercial side of things.
And there are the wheat numbers.
And wheat, that continues to be pretty much being held by the commercials. I think in this report, we're 80-20. So I think in the March one, we were 75-25. So again, most of the wheat is being held by the commercial firms. There's not much being left out on farms.
Moving on to the acreage report. First thing to note is when they did their cutoff for the survey, there were still 3.6 million acres of corn to plant and 11.5 million acres of soybeans. So of course, these numbers are subject to revision as we get through the season. But here are the main crops for planted acres. What stood out to you here?
Well, what was surprising, everybody was running one direction for corn, thinking we were going to see higher corn acres, and it actually turned out to be a little less than the March estimate. And of course, we knew it was going to be more than the previous year. That was pretty much a given. But the fact that it came in a little bit less was a little bit friendly. The other part is that soybean acres were a little bit less. Now, everybody was expecting that if we were going to see corn acres switch, it would have gone into soybeans, but that just wasn't the case. So we're seeing smaller soybean acres. On the flip side, you look at the wheat market, and again, less spring wheat, a little bit more winter wheat. That was a little bit of a surprise. But then when you look at the two at the bottom, cotton and sorghum, I think that really surprised a lot of traders because nobody expected cotton acres to increase that much or sorghum acres to drop that much.
And again, we talk about those not because we grow them up here, but because they do affect corn and soybean acreage if those acres are shifting. Principal crop acres went down again. We're always trying to figure out where these acres are going. We never have, but.
And it's very interesting that we lost, again, this year. And, when you look back to, I think it was for 23, we were down from 319. So, I mean, to show the chart here. So it's very interesting that we have lost close to that 8 million, 9 million acres and really no good explanation of where it's going. So, at this point, it's been interesting. It'll be interesting to see where the harvested acres come into play. I would expect that they would be somewhat flat and close to what we've been seeing the trend from the last couple of years.
And this is where planted acres of these principal crops compared to last year. North Dakota, South Dakota seeing a bit more acres than we had last year.
But there's an awful lot of red, especially when you look through the rest of the plain states, and then also look at the major corn belt states. There's some decrease in acres in just about every one of the major corn and soybean states.
Looking individual crops now, corn, unsurprisingly, all the major states are increasing their corn acres this year. And then again, here we are looking at acres over the last 10 years for corn.
Starting to see a little more volatility in the switching back and forth between acres, between corn and soybeans, as we still try to find that acres base. And part of the drop from last year was due to the crush plants. This year, we saw a little bit of moving away from the biofuels. Now we're seeing some swing back towards biofuels. It'll be interesting to see where these acres come into play for 26.
And again, like we said, corn acres are up, and they are up in most of the states, including North Dakota and South Dakota. Both are expected to see record corn yields here, or corn acres, I mean.
And look at the Delta areas and some of those fringe areas. Now, this also is something important to look at, because what's the potential for that trend line yield to happen when a majority of the increase in the acres comes in the fringe areas?
Moving on to soybeans. Most states saw a decline. North Dakota, though, unchanged from last year. Did that surprise you at all?
It did. I thought we would have seen a little bit better, a little more acres in some of these states. So, North Dakota, the only one being unchanged, the rest of them seeing a little bit of losses. I thought with some of the late planting we saw in Missouri, in Illinois, we'd see a little more soybeans, but that just wasn't the case.
And again, here we are with acres over the last 10 years. And you said, kind of the opposite of corn. As corn goes up, soybeans go down, and vice versa there. And again, soybean acres are down, and they're down pretty much everywhere.
That's, again, because of the increase in the corn acres, except for North Dakota showing no change there. But we're seeing some pretty big drops in some major states again. So, next year it'll be interesting to see if some of these switch back towards soybeans once they've run planting corn, if they're going to try to stay in some sort of a crop rotation.
And then corn and soybeans, when we add them together, now we've kind of got a different looking map here between the gains and the losses from last year.
And that kind of makes you wonder, where did some of those acres go? If they're not planting corn and soybeans, especially when you look at it in Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, what's the other crop that they're going to? And so that's going to be a little bit interesting moving forward. I know we did see some of the specialty crops see some increases, and that certainly is going to show up in some of those states.
Winter wheat, just putting this in here because, of course, the amount of acres there affects our spring wheat. Fairly flat from last year there. Moving on to spring.
I was going to say with winter wheat, we kind of expected that. I mean, we've seen this is our third look at the acres, from the January to the March and now this one. So kind of expected to see a little bit of trimming. What's going to be interesting is that we're seeing a bigger drop in the harvested acres, and that'll probably continue to drop because of the big rains that they've been seeing in the Southern Plains.
So moving on to spring wheat. Again, not a lot of states grow spring wheat, but they are all lower this year except South Dakota unchanged.
Which, we estimated that North Dakota would see lower spring wheat acres just because of, the quality issues we had last year, and because of word price and mainly because of the quality. Not a big surprise that we saw it drop this much, but now we've got a decent crop coming so far. We'll see where it comes into play.
And again, here's the acres over the last 10 years. We have really been on a downtrend for spring wheat since 2018 was the peak there.
That is almost, other than seeing a little bit of an increase in the 23, it goes to show just how much of out of favor that the spring wheat market or spring wheat crop has come into play, and losing close to 3.2 million in that short a period of time is a large drop.
And again, like we said, not many states grow it. All of them were lower this year. Moving on to durum. North Dakota did increase their durum acres. They bucked the trend of the other states there. Did that surprise you at all?
In you're looking at it, not really. I kind of thought that we'd see a little bit more durum acres, mainly because of trouble up in Canada, but also because of the higher durum price for crop insurance. So I figured that we would see a few more acres of durum. And with the weather forecast calling for a hotter, drier, June, July, and August, it kind of leads more towards durum. That hasn't played out though, so it's going to be interesting to see just where this durum quality could fall into play, as that is very susceptible to these wet conditions.
And again, acres there have seen flat for a few years. Now we're starting to increase a little bit. And again, not many states grow it. North Dakota was the only increase. Moving on to the minor crops. I guess number to me that stuck out here was the canola acres, big drop in the canola acres. And again, that's mainly a North Dakota crop as well.
That was a big surprise. We've heard rumors of some disease concerns up in the northern tier counties, and talk of maybe some acres decreasing. Surprised that it was as big as it was. Actually, I'm also surprised to see barley acres grabbing some acres, especially because of the issues that we've been having on the malt side of things, producers not being able to deliver. So that increase surprised me a little bit. Dry beans doesn't surprise me as wet as we were, that we did see a few more acres just because of guys wanting to try to get something in a little later season. And sunflowers making a good recovery.
And again, kind of to wrap all this up, if we look at principal crops, which are the bulk of the crops, we grow, of course, corn and soybeans at the very top of the list. That's pretty normal there. But if we switch to looking at the percent change from last year, sunflowers, huge winner there, up 38.5% from last year, and canola and millet being the losers in acreage. And then when you flip that to acres instead of percents, of course, corn and soybeans dominate those lists with the acre shifts. So now that we have this behind us, what's the market going to focus on?
Really, right now, what we'll watch is weather. I mean, we're going into the second half of the calendar year. We're going to go into also pollination for corn and soybeans, especially corn in the Corn Belt. So right now, weather is going to take the lead as far as where this market's going to be going. Demand continues to be strong for corn. That is something that we're going to have to continue to watch, as USDA will have to come in and increase exports in their next report, just because we're already at USDA's projections for exports for corn. So that will continue to pull down stocks, but will we see that offset by something as far as the new crop is concerned? That's going to be the interesting part that they play, or the game that they're going to play for corn. Soybeans, we're going to wait for some sort of a trade deal. Right now, that's going to be the other big part that this market's going to be paying attention to, is whether or not and when we start getting trade deals signed and get that, at least know a little bit more of what our potential export program could be going into the last half of 25, first part of 26. So right now, I think it'll be just weather and trade deals and potential demand.
Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, of course, you know how to get a hold of us. Give us a call, send us a text or an email. And again, thank you.